Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Ferry. Welcome to another rebroadcast from the RTB archives. From Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book. I'm Elizabeth Ferry, and I'm here with my co-host, John Plotz. Hello, John.
Hello.
And with our guest, Greg Childs. Hi, Greg.
Hi.
Greg is from the Brandeis History Department, and he's here to talk with us about why and how words matter in the conversations around the attack on the Capitol of January 6th and other public mobilizations of the far right. Greg is the author of a book forthcoming from Cambridge University Press called Seditious Spaces, Race, Freedom, and the 1798 Conspiracy in Bahia, Brazil. The book focuses on an anti-racist artisans movement in Bahia, with particular emphasis on the organization and promotion of the movement in the city's public and private spaces. He's an expert in thinking about concepts of revolution, sedition, insurrection, and so on in the context of the Americas as a whole. So, Greg, do you want to start us off by talking a little bit about your work and what it makes you think about the events of the last couple of weeks or beyond?
Sure, I can certainly do that. So, I think as you mentioned, my work very much centers on the concept of sedition and its uses, its ability to sort of cover a range of so-called crimes that at the time of my research, in the time period I'm focusing on, it was often used to smother any attempt to express claims of independence. Yeah, I'm looking at people of African descent who feel, that their life choices, their possibilities for advancement in career and sort of life in general are being halted by, a prohibitive regime. And so as they organize and start to speak publicly, they're charged with sedition. And then they're later charged with conspiracy once it becomes clear that they were organizing to have a rebellion too. Sedition seems to be able to sort of have a life and attach itself to a number of kind of expressions of political conflict. And I think what helped me see that more clearly in this event that we just lived through is that there was a claim to be taking the nation back from those who had caused a broken society to emerge. And it's interesting because the claim certainly sticks according to how we understand sedition historically. The problem comes into play where in the United States, sedition very clearly and definitively became codified in law as any attempt to threaten with harm, with violence. The physical contact element became much more pervasive in the U.S. context. Whereas in most of the societies that, I've looked at, whether it's Brazil, even in Cuba, where I've done research, even in France, revolutionary France, the idea of sedition is much more tied to speech.
Right.
Physical contact and violence can be there, but it need not be there. It's the very idea of a public threat, period, bar none.
We've seen in the last, really rapidly kind of changing vocabulary over the last week and a half, where, some of the kind of signposts along the way have been protesters, patriots, rioters, insurrection, and I think insurgents is kind of wrapped up in that, at least in the U.S. context.
I think Biden used insurrection in his speech.
Yeah, and kind of landing a little bit, at least within a universe of discourse that is condemning the attacks on insurrection. But you have some qualms about that, right, Greg?
Well, it's primarily that concepts have historical life, and I think what is starting to be forgotten is how much insurrection was typically associated with, particularly in colonial eras and in areas that are still under sort of imperial rule or imperial design. Insurrection is normally levied at people who are trying to transform a society, not people who are trying to maintain a social order.
Right.
It's understood as people who operate without the strong support of the organs and institutions of the government, not those who, even if they're losing a presidency, have all the other institutions of disciplinary action, of legal power at their disposal. It's something that I think is, we need to think more about what people have at their disposal in terms of state power, access to the most important organs of the state. I mean, have police officers sliding aside and letting people walk through. You have, police officers in other instances putting their necks on young black men. So you have the organs of the state clearly in your control. They're clearly aligned with you. No matter if you're losing this presidency at local levels, people will still go back to worlds and states and cities where the regime is very Trump-like.
Is there an argument that this is a legitimation crisis? Like, is that what we're talking about here? Because the word rebellion, based on what you're saying, Greg, implies the authority is no longer legitimate in its control of violence or force or whatever. And so you get a legitimation crisis if there seems to be somehow like a sanctioned response to that. Is that, I mean, are we at that point right now? Is that what people are fighting over when they're fighting over what to call this?
I think this is where I'm actually sort of like pleased and perhaps a little hopeful. It seems like people are thinking about the future and history and what we're going to think about ourselves in this moment, which I think is a little, I don't think that's always the case in things like this. If we think back to our lives, let's think back. I don't think most of us who were alive, of course it is now, I don't think most of us who were alive at the time were thinking about what do we call Rodney King's beatdown, like over and over? How do we take this to the news? How do we fight? Right. It's not, this is not what you're calling it. This out of control black man. This is police brutality at its highest form, right? People got outraged. We got, we got ready for whatever kind of conflict could come, but a sustained sort of media, like just shoving it down their throats. Like, this is how you have to think about this. It has to
critical. It's interesting because the genre of the side-by-side photo, right? Where you see, okay, well, this was the response when the Black Lives Matter people were protesting, and this is the response. I think that really it's sort of the visual expression of what you're describing, this kind of self-consciousness.
Yeah, I think we're doing that now. I think people are doing that. And I think the politics of naming is taking place because I think it's very critical how this gets described, how this gets marked, how this gets, in whatever case we may think of it, archived, whether we're talking about like at the state level, at a local level. We need to think about very, very carefully what words we're using, because some of them really do matter. And
I think it seems significant that we haven't agreed for the purposes of this podcast on what we're calling the Capitol Hill incident, right? We're still, I mean, like a year from now, what's the Wikipedia article going to be called?
I mean, I never fully thought it out. And just, that's what it's always seemed to me from the moment I heard insurrection. I thought, I don't know how this is an insurrection for people in power. This seems like they're trying to that they see a revolution already happening, and that for this is the counter. Like I see this as counter revolution.
Huh. Wow.
Counterinsurgency. That's even a better way of putting it. Counterinsurgency. I don't see
counterinsurgency.
They have control of the state.
Right.
They have control of the state. They have control of the. They don't. Okay. Maybe not control. Maybe that's too harsh of language for some people, but they have an accord, let's say that, with a number of organs from the Supreme Court all the way down to the police. They have a majority accord. And that speaks volumes about when you think about what's happening to your country, if you're on that side of the ball game. I can see how you would see yourself losing everything that's been worked for the last 4 to 5 years in terms of making this country one where you don't have to hide, where you don't have to be in the shadows with your racism, where you get to be fully and completely who you are, even if people have cameras on you and you can tell them, yes, I believe in white supremacy. I've definitely seen those videos floating around. And so you get this society where they're really feeling this, and like, all right, we've turned a corner. This is our country again, and we're never giving it up. And here we go. And they won. There's no way they won. Who voted for Biden? Nobody I know. But it becomes this narrative of corruption was already baked into it. And why do we even play this game?
Right.
Sedition doesn't have to have anything to do with actually attacking the organs of government. It could very well be, just putting yourself in a position where a movement or an environment is happening around you and you just happen to be working in it. Case in fact, there's this major seditious conspiracy in Portugal in 1758. It's an attempt on the life of the king. Doesn't work, but it's an absolute attack on royalty. And that is what makes this a case of treasonous sedition. This is what makes it a case of treasonous sedition. And once that category of crime has been, placed on this entire, area made up, so to speak, of 3 or 4 families, estates, all those people working in it are also engaged in seditious conspiracy.
Let me ask you, both of you. So we just came off a conversation with David Cunningham about asymmetrical policing and about the sort of both coded and not so coded racializing of different, descriptions of protest or social action or social movements. And that's clearly a dimension here. And from your work, I know that it's a dimension of what was happening in Bahia as well. How does questions about race get sort of smuggled in or just carried in these conversations?
Well, I would say in the era I'm working in, and I think you see and continue to see arguments about this in the U.S. context with John Brown, but it's different because of the landscape of Latin America and the way people think about, what does wealth do for you as a light-skinned person? You become white. You're not passing. You're just understood as white in the everyday social order. I think what happens, it happens in the exact opposite way too. Too much closeness to Blackness will get you labeled as someone who's part of a Black rebellion. And so, one of the strongest cases of this in my research is a guy who is a teacher of Latin grammar, and surprise, surprise, teachers didn't make a lot of money back then either. So he's not making a lot of money. He gets involved in this conspiracy because he happens to know and have conversations on the regular with a couple of the organizers. He gets involved in it and gets arrested, and he is sentenced to 50 lashes in public. Now, at the last minute, that's commuted, and he is sent to non-Portuguese speaking parts of Africa. So to kind of totally put him in no man's land. But in both of those cases, the judgment is that this was a crime carried out by a caste of mulattoes. So he's become part of that caste. He's sent as a white man to Africa in a place where there are no Portuguese. So, the idea is that he can't lean on anything to sort of prop himself up and move through this order. So in that world, I think you get classified as Black, whereas I think, here that happens, that it's not a unique phenomenon in Brazil that white people get involved in rebellions that are primarily about ending slavery. And so that's not a unique thing. I think, when it happens in the United States, it just becomes a question of, do we classify this as, a race traitor if you're on one side of this historical argument, or do you classify this as someone who was just a man of his time, and some of it was good, some of it was bad, or think of him as, a white, one of the few white men who, was actually fighting for, Black liberation.
Yeah, anyway, or a visionary. That's another one. Yeah.
So you look at it in those registers. But if we take this to like current situations, right, from Charlottesville to, the Capitol, there isn't a narrative afterwards of these white people all of a sudden being Black. They continue to be white. And I think that's very interesting that, you can participate in such actions and not really lose the prerogatives of whiteness, even if you're so-called publicly shamed.
Right.
Because, you and I, when we were talking before, you were mentioning Hannah Arendt on revolution. And I was thinking about that a lot too. And I was going to ask you how you think about this distinction that she makes between, in her mind, the kind of valorized political revolution versus the dangers of a social revolution. So I admire Arendt a lot, as listeners of the podcast will know, but like in her, what she praises in the American Revolution seems like a capacity to make a distinction that I hear you saying is actually a bad faith distinction, doesn't really exist, because the distinction is between abstract theoretical claims for conceptual categories like equality, universal human rights, things that are known as goods for all, versus what Arendt says is kind of like the contamination and the emotional complications of social role privilege. And she just kind of wants to bracket those. But I hear you saying that it's that there's something shaky about that logic. Am I reading you right? Or
yeah, I mean, if we're gonna cut to the chase here, I mean, I think her problem in terms of the social and the political is that she refuses to see that any of these lofty concepts are all concepts about controlling the bare rights of life. That if the social is just about people working and toiling and they never rise to the level of thought, it's more a question of this is the result of a conflict over who gets to distribute and control rights. And for that, at that level, she's bracketed something in the interest of making you forget the hinge that holds it together. And the hinge that holds that bracket together is none of this is possible without a conflict over who controls access and to rights, who controls access to using them and distributing them. And when we start to talk about making laws and creating police, it's about making a social order work so that the distribution of goods, of the generation of wealth, all of that operates smoothly. So, she has an idea of what, is, I think her, and you can take this all the way, I think, even to J.G.A. Pocock and his arguments in his book, The
Machiavellian Moment.
Yeah, where the United States is the last virtuous revolution in that argument, right? It's the last one in which virtue, rather than the concrete rule, the operations of organization and logic. It's the last one in which there's a political grammar of things that correlate to each other, or equality and liberty and civic rights. Like these things have a logic that you might call linguistically strong in terms of how he makes his argument, how Pocock makes his argument. But it remains that within that field of thought, virtue kind of speaks to logic, not in the abstract, but in a system of words and languages and concepts that supposedly cohere and make a unity. And I think the social revolution seems messy, and that's why it needs to be bracketed off. But that for me, it really hinges on the fact that this is a conflict over who controls access and distribution of rights. And in that regard, counterinsurgents at the Capitol believe that the forthcoming future will deprive them of the access to rights and goods. Right. And all of a sudden, those who were on the side of we are the world of lofty ideas, those who run our country, you know, the organizers and rulers of our country are of our you know, background, you know, they're gonna work for us. Mm-hmm. And I think now it's more than ever, I think, because of the way, you know, the right feels about race. I don't think people really understand how stubborn that commitment to mm-hmm. If the only thing I have that's better than you is my whiteness, I'm gonna hold on to it.
Right. It's the whiteness as property kind of.
And it's like we had it.
Right.
I don't think we think enough about like how these people are feeling right now. We had it.
Yeah.
We had it in our hands. We thought we were going to get another 4 years. I think some of these people thought this was going to be a new Jacksonian era where Trump creates a system and begin to appoint new, the new head of state. If you get Trump's sign off, you know you're gonna be able to walk into the White House. I think they thought this was the inauguration of a new Jacksonian.
Although I wonder, Greg, tell me what you think, or John, whether that kind of investment in whiteness or the sort of, you know, the wages of whiteness always has that feeling of we almost had it and now we're losing it. If that's kind of like a constitutive dimension of it. Because that's what we see in the Civil War. That's what we see during Reconstruction. That's what we see in, you know, all of the kind of moments of violence against Black people, lynching, and, you know, all kinds of things. That's kind of like in the weave of it, right?
I think I think we can always make in this scenario links to and I would just say the long shadow of the Civil War kind of is we're feeling it more right now. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I would say it's always there. I just think it's different now because they thought 8 years before Trump was a nightmare.
Right.
You wouldn't survive. And they came out with Trump. It's almost like after 8 years with Obama, when everyone really thought it was going to just stay on the Democratic ticket and Hillary Clinton would win, some people actually really thought that we were turning a corner on some things. And mm-hmm. I think once, you know, Trump got elected and thinking about how people felt and how people looked the day after, the next few days after, mm-hmm. it was this shell shock, and right. I think it's a shell shock. Or I can't say a shell shock. It's we knew they were gonna steal it. We knew we were gonna do it. They've been corrupt since they put that Black president in the office. Right? There's a narrative here. Just, you know.
Okay, so maybe this is a good moment to shift to our recallable books section. So I'm going to ask you first, Greg, as our guest. What would you like to bring to the table?
So yeah, after some thought on this, I'll pivot back to me thinking about Ayanna Pressley. You know, we're here in Boston, so it hits real close to home. But thinking about her in that Capitol building and basically attempting to occupy space that she had earned and worked to occupy in the Senate, and then to see, you know, these stories about the buttons being ripped out. I just, you know, it made me think about how Black women in particular, and it's very stark and I think on point in terms of being able to sort of like be spot on the money in this case, how Black women try to work through these different geographies of power and map them differently and sort of say, I belong in the space and I'm going to use it in a way that's different from yours, and repeatedly have to come up across, you know, whether it be the plantation master, the overseer, the police, the teacher, the man, whatever it may be, kind of trying to think about putting you back in place, pushing you out of space. And so I was thinking about that a lot, and it kind of brought up for me Stephanie M. Camp's book, Closer to Freedom, Enslaved Women and Everyday Resistance in the Plantation South, which is really the book that lays out this idea of rival geographies and how Black women move through them and how they are affected by them. So yeah, that book kind of was very key for my thinking in talking about and thinking about counterinsurgency at the Capitol.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks. John?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to, I think the first ever scholarly book review I wrote in 1996 was this book by Charles Tilly called Popular Contention.
When you were only 5, John. That's
what?
Nice. When you were only 5, right?
Exactly, right? Yeah. But I think I was bald then too. So it's called Popular Contention in Great Britain, 1758 to 1834. And I admit that sounds like a snooze of a title, but this is before the days of digital humanities. But Tilly and I think a team of researchers did something really amazing, which is they looked at the verb, subject, object combinations that different newspapers used to describe different kinds of uprising and discontent. And he's able to chart this genealogy of what he calls the rise of new collective repertoires of action. He actually has a whole analogy to jazz, to introducing a new musical motif and playing it out. And it was just such an eye-opener to me, because it was actually, you mentioned Pocock before, Greg, but it's the similar logic of like etymology as concept, that the way that people use different verbs is not just going to tell you as a historian retrospectively what they were thinking, it's telling them what to think, how to position one kind of violent action versus another violent action. And it's not a simple story. It's not like, oh, well, the Tories described collective violence with these verbs and the Whigs described it with these other verbs, but it's more like it's kind of the ebb and flow of how different events take on, different nuances and different meanings depending on the sorts of verbs you use to describe the action. And it was just an eye opener for me, that book. And I went back to it this afternoon and I'm like, this is still amazing. So.
Great. All right. Well, what I'm going to bring is, as usual, not the thing that I thought I was going to bring at the beginning of this conversation, but instead George Lipsitz's The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, which is a book that was written about 20 years ago, and that really kind of thinks through the various mechanisms by which whiteness becomes this category that sort of, like other forms of capital, reaps benefits, material, ideological, institutional benefits. I have not read the reissue, the 20th anniversary reissue of this, but I hear that it has a new introduction that speaks specifically about questions of white fears of loss and the rise of the alt-right. So clearly relevant to our conversation. All right, so what remains is for us to thank Greg very much for joining us today. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you for having me. It was a good talk. A lot of wonderful things came up. I'm glad that I could participate. And
yeah. Well, let's all keep talking and listening, as you say.
Yeah, definitely. All right.
Recall this book is the brainchild of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. It's affiliated with Public Books and is recorded and edited in the Media Lab of Brandeis Library, usually, and also in our bedrooms and living rooms, by Plotz, Ferry, and a cadre of colleagues here in the Boston area and beyond. Our music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy, Fly Away. Sound editing is by Claire Ogden, and production assistance, including website design and social media, is done by Nai Kim. Mark DeLello oversees and advises on technological matters, and we appreciate the support of University librarian Matthew Sheehy and Dean Dorothy Hodgson, and of the Mandel Center for the Humanities at Brandeis. We always want to hear from you with our comments, criticisms, and suggestions for future episodes. You can email us directly, or you can contact us via social media and our website, which is recallthisbook.org. If you enjoyed this show, please be sure to write a review or rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, or elsewhere. And you may be interested in checking out past episodes, including conversation with Hayal Akarsu on community policing in Turkey, and with David Cunningham on the asymmetrical policing and its history in the United States. So thank you all for joining us, and goodbye until next time.